Live.
Well,
Say hi.
To our Rainbow Studio. I'm your host, Craig Winn. This off to my left is Wookie. And we're about to begin a new chapter in Appalling Twistianity as we change our focus from listening to what Yahowah had to say about his beloved son, his chosen one, the Messiah, the former and returning king of Yisrael, who happens to be Dowd, not the mythical Jesus. And with Yahowah himself proving that Christianity is untrue and that Jesus never existed and therefore that Paul lied, we're now going to turn our attention to Paul himself and show that Paul is sufficient in and of himself to prove that he is a liar. And it, of course, is interesting that the author of the letter to the Galatians, which is Paul's first letter, it's also the first letter and book that would be written in Christianity. Unknown to most Christians, the first 14 books of the Christian New Testament, in terms of the order they were written, were all written by Paul. The current order of things, where there is the book of Matthew, followed by Mark, Luke, and John, and then the book of Acts, is totally inappropriate. Matthew would not be written until 95 CE. It was written by an impostor who did nothing but plagiarize three sources. 70 to 80% of Matthew is plagiarized from the prior works of Mark and Luke, with the final 20% coming from the Ebonim, who were fluent in Hebrew and wrote what the actual Messiah actually said at the time, and that would have been Dowd. And the book of John, we have no idea who wrote the book of John, but it was also written around 95 CE. It was written in Ephesus, and there's nothing to connect it with anybody who would have been a disciple of the mythical Jesus. So what we really have is the first two books that would be considered gospels are using the term that Paul invented. Gospel is a term that Paul invents. That's how it appears in those texts. And both men were associated with Paul, and they wrote the Gospel of Paul, doing so about 10 years after Paul's death, around 75 CE. So when we talk about Paul and his letters, it should be known and accepted, because it's true, that the inventor of the Christian religion is Paul, and that the first, as I say, 14 books of the Christian New Testament chronologically were all written by Paul. So the author of this first book, which is Galatians, the first book to exist in Christianity, the book that introduced the idea that there was an Iosu Christu, that was a counterfeit of the actual Messiah Dowd, penned in 52 CE, begins with Sha'uwl, which was the man's name, changing his name so that he would embrace a name chosen from among those of the Roman occupiers of Judea, which tells you whose side he was on. It begins Palos, that is of Latin origin. Then he says, I'm an apostle. But the issue with claiming to be an apostle is it's like saying that somebody is the Christ. It's like saying that somebody is a disciple. What? There is no prophecy. There's no mention anywhere in the Torah, prophets, and Psalms of an apostle or anyone remotely akin to an apostle. There's no mention of a Paul. So you can't say, I am this fellow, when there is no reference to such a fellow. You hear commotion going on. It's the dogs deciding that they were going to make this their time to play in our set. So there is just nothing to identify any individual as an apostle. It's true that Sha'uwl, by his real name, is mentioned throughout the prophets, and they call Yahowah's voice, they call Paul the plague of death, the son of evil and the father of lies. So it's his mentions in the prophets are not positive. His actual name, too, of course, is synonymous with Sheol, which is hell. So Palos, an apostle, he chose the title for himself because there is no such title in Hebrew or any variation of it. So he's appointed a title for himself. And then he claims that this title is not from men, not even by the means of man, although it is a Greek title, and therefore he took it from men, the languages of men, because there is no such title pertaining to God, none. So he's begun with a lie, two lies. One is he changed his name. So if he changed his name, he's trying to disown his past. And second of all, he claims that he was an apostle, not from men, not even by means of man, but to the contrary on behalf of Iosu Christu. Now, that's the first mention in this world of an Iosu Christu. That would be a first mention in any world. I don't know why I said this world, but it's the first mention ever of an Iosu Christu. He was invented with those words. And if you're looking for a Jesus Christ, Jesus was not spoken as a name until the 17th century. It was in the third edition of the King James, which is actually the King Iams at the time, Bible, that Iosu was changed to Jesus. So here is the first time ever that there is a mention of an Iosu Christu. Now, the combination of problems here is Iosu Christu never existed. He is nothing but a counterfeit of Dowd. So you can't be an apostle of a myth unless you want to be a writer for children. The second issue is that Iosu Christu is not a Hebrew name, and yet he wants to put this individual in a prophetic setting, and there is no Iosu Christu referred to anywhere in the Torah and prophets. You have just enormous problems beyond the fact that you have Christu following Iosu. That's not possible. The only reason that it sounds appropriate now, people say Jesus Christ, that is to say, I'm really stupid, is what that says. For you to say Jesus Christ, forget it that it's Iosu Christu. It says, I am too dumb for words. What you're doing here is assuming that Christo is the last name. But what you have to buy into to see any of this as saying is you have to assume that Christu is a translation, a transliteration of a translation of a title. And if it's a title, then it has to be Christu Iosu. It can't be Iosu Christu. It's like it's King George. It's Genghis Khan. It's in titles precede names. It is the Messiah Dowd, for example. It's Malak, King Dowd. But he has that afterwards, so that he has created a person where the title is now a name. And of course, then you have the other issues of Christo is from Christos, which means to be drugged in the Greek language. And also, there is no person that would be known by the name Christo, or even if you were to translate it and forget about that it means drugged and has no correlation of any kind with Messiah, the only prophecy that spoke of a coming Messiah was spoken by the Messiah himself. Gabriel is the one who delivered it. Gabriel is God's most capable and competent man. Gabriel happens to be Dowd. Dowd is the person that Yahowah 3 times said he is the Messiah. And So you can't have a title that you're going to say has any relevancy to anything that has been proclaimed when that title belongs to another. So you have a bogus name, a bogus title. They're presented out of order. And then you have also a title for the man himself who just changed his name, and there's no reference to that title anywhere to give it any credibility. And if that were not enough, because Iosu Christu never existed, guess who never quotes him? He claims that he was authorized by means of Iosu Christu, except for the fact he never once quotes Iosu Christu. And Iosu Christu, even in the gospel accounts that were written anywhere from 20 to 50 years after this letter, guess what? They don't have Iosu Christu mentioning that Palos, or even by his given name, Sha'uwl, was going to be an apostle of his. So you don't have any endorsement from Iosu Christu. You don't have any mention from Iosu Christu of Paul. And you don't have any citation from Paul of Iosu Christu. In other words, he is lying through his teeth. He is presenting himself as the God of his religion, and he is just using this name as a way of well, kind of the royal we. We're speaking together. We're in this together. Then he claims that Iosu Christu and the God Father of the one having roused and awakened him out of a lifeless corpse. You got some problems here. So now you're claiming for your Iosu Christu. You're misappropriating the title Messiah, putting it out of order, and then you're writing Theos as if that were the proper title for God. You don't know his name. And if you don't know Yahweh's name and you don't use Yahweh's name according to Yahweh, you are a false prophet. Therefore, he has identified himself as a false prophet by referring to God as Theos. And on top of that, by saying Father, he's stealing a second time from Dowd, because according to Yahweh, the only person that can claim to be the Son of God and has God said, I am his Father, only person that applies to, again, is Dowd, David. So he is setting himself up as a two-time counterfeiter already, a thief. Then he goes on to say, of the one having roused and awakened him out of a lifeless corpse. Since Paul will claim that this Iosu Christu fellow was the fullness of the Godhead, that all of God fed into that man. So that was all there was to God. How did he die? Who killed him? How does one, if your God is so small, first of all, that he fits into a man, then you have a really pathetic God. And your God is not God. A God that the entirety would fit into a man, I'm telling you, ain't God. It is so stupid to think otherwise. It's ridiculous. And then to believe that God can be killed, that God himself was a lifeless corpse. But wait a minute, you're saying the Father was the one who aroused him, but you're saying that later that your Iosu Christu was the fullness of the Godhead. He was everything. So how was that possible? Or you're not supposed to think this through. You're just supposed to believe what I, Paul, say.
Yeah, just stop pointing out our contradictions.
Stop pointing out our contradictions. That's not fair. Galatians 1:1, that was not a very good start. It is interesting, indeed telling, that this man who was born Sha'uwl would choose to rename himself, discarding his Hebrew heritage in the process. The language of God's revelation was rejected to select a Latin nom de plume. Sha'uwl, now Palos, was thereby estranging himself from Yahweh's testimony while reflecting his allegiance to Rome, mankind's most powerful and most sadistic kingdom. There was no place on earth more overtly religious, more aggressively political, more savagely militaristic, more covetous and deplorable than Rome. At this moment, no other nation was as morally bankrupt or as ruthlessly oppressive. And it would be Rome that would forever earn Yahweh's wrath for destroying his covenant home in 70 CE and his city in 133 CE. It is Rome that Gabriel, Dowd, David, God's most competent and courageous man, called as the fourth beast that grew out of Babylon, the one that was so vicious and savage. This change in identity, therefore, in shifting alliances, should have been sufficient in and of itself to motivate readers to Sha'uwl, question him. Now, the opening line affirms that Palos, using his replacement moniker, wanted his audience to believe that he was an apostle, and thus either on the same footing or at least in the league of, or above, if you will, the supposed disciples that he would write about. He said that he had been apostolos, prepared and placed as a delegate and messenger of Iosu Christu, which is telling because the translators of this statement correctly transliterated Polos's and apostolos, and yet could not accurately render the Hebrew name Iosu was replacing. It's interesting, of course, that the Gospels, the character attributed to Jesus, said no such thing. The title apostle was not given to Sha'uwl Palos by Yahowah either. He's 0 for 2. In fact, he's going to have to find a different God, because Yahowah is the only God according to the Torah, prophets, and Psalms, and he didn't afford Sha'uwl that title. In fact, he tells us that Sha'uwl is the plague of death. Sorry, pal. In fact, rather than speaking for God, God said that Sha'uwl Palos spoke presumptuously and deceitfully for himself. This is proof, I should say, that Sha'uwl sought the status he did not deserve and did not earn, which is the nature of all charlatans. It's like Trump saying, "I'm the greatest president ever." Palos' claim that his message was unrelated to any man or men is also untrue. He, by his own admission, was trained as a rabbi. He was the first to actually declare that he was a rabbi in writing. And this, like every letter Paul wrote, reads very much like the Talmud, which is a collection of rabbinical arguments regarding the Torah, which are designed to empower the words of men above those inspired by God. Now, it should be noted that if he had written Hamashiach Yahusha rather than Iosu Christu, even that would have been wrong. While Yahusha is a Hebrew name, and it appears to be the one Iosu seeks to replace, the only Yahusha known to Yahowah was Yosha ben Nun. And Yosha ben Nun was Moshe's successor. Long time before this event. Further, Hamashiach, the Messiah title, belongs to one man, to Dowd, with the Melech king, Ra'ah shepherd, and Ben Elohim also being the very son of God. He's speaking of God's beloved David. Yahweh's testimony in this regard is comprehensive, it's consistent, and it's incontrovertible. That's why I began this series by taking you to what Yahweh wrote of Dowd, naming him in the 89th Mizmor. Dowd is the chosen one. He is the one who enabled the covenant and therefore the one who fulfilled Pesach, Matzah, and Makodim. He is the Messiah. He is the Son of God. Just no debate, no question about it. To claim anything else is to be ignorant. Therefore, someone familiar with the Torah Wanabi should never have misappropriated a title that had been given by God to his beloved Dowd. And perhaps that is why even the myth attributed to Jesus and the Gospels is never recorded referring to himself as the Messiah or Son of God. Never. Repeatedly and exclusively, he called himself the Son of Man, which is the title used in Ezekiel, and Ezekiel was a false prophet. So it's not looking good for the myth thus far. Now pause a moment and consider the gravity of these realizations. Had Paul respected Dowd's proper designation rather than recasting and misrepresenting his titles, there would have been no Christians, and Jews might actually have understood who Dowd was when he served as the Passover lamb and what he was doing. There were two names changed in Sha'ul's opening salvo, both of which were originally Hebrew, with one, Sha'uwl, becoming the Roman, and the other becoming Iosu Christu, and this was rendered as if the mythical man were Greek. With the first stroke of his pen, Paul revealed his magnum opus, replacement theology. All things Yahweh had promised to Abraham, Yishak, and Jacob, to Dowd and to Yisrael and Yehudim, throughout his Torah and Nabiim, were snatched away from them, and they were awarded to the edifice that Paul was creating, the Christian church. Stealing from one to give to the other. When we cast both men under their given names, the story is clear. Sha'uwl was trying to hide from the prophecies Yahweh had spoken to condemn him. And in the process, Dowd's name was replaced while Yahweh's name was abolished. The actual Messiah's second life as our Savior was obscured. This is the disingenuous foundation of Christendom, a religion whose very name is predicated upon an obvious fraud. And it is all evident to see right here in the first line of Palos's first letter. Truth was the initial casualty. Life was the second. Had Dowd not fulfilled his role as Pesach El, the Passover lamb, death would be the end of life for all of us. There is no other means to immortality. This is one of many truths that Paul obfuscated, damning all Christians. Dowd knew who he was and what he was doing. It is Christians who have misidentified and miscast him in the form of another to promote their religion rather than the relationship that Dowd sacrificed himself to achieve. It would be their loss. Now, whether you concur with Yahowah and Dowd on this matter, this junction, is your choice. My job is to tell you the truth, to lay all the words God revealed face up on the table and explain what they mean, so long as you are not disparaging Yahowah and Yehudim. What you decide is, well, it's your business. If properly identifying the characters in Yahowah's story, beginning with God himself as Yahowah, and coming to appreciate the roles each play, such as Dowd as our Savior, is important to you, then mark this page and set this book down for a good while. Please go to the yadayah.com website and open volumes 1 of Coming Home, A Voice, beginning reading there until you're satisfied. You can read on to Coming Home volumes 2 and 3, and soon there'll be a 4th. Then if you're curious as to the nature of the ploy that Paul is presenting, then you can return to Twistianity for the sake of the billions still beguiled by this deceit, or God's people who have been so harassed by it. Other than the two speeches recorded by the Ebonim and pilfered by Matthew, inclusive of the instruction on the Mount and perhaps the Olivet Discourse, we know very little of what Dowd said during the second of three lives. The only eyewitness reporting on the fulfillment of Pesach Matzah and Bikurim was composed 1,000 years in advance in first person by the lone participant, Dowd himself, in Mizmor Psalms 22 and 88. Although they are more than sufficient in their gruesome as well as glorious detail that we don't need anything more. There is a reason we have the words of Yahowah's prophets accurately preserved in the language that God and they spoke, and we have nothing from Iosu Christu similarly maintained. Yahowah told his prophets, beginning with Moshe, to write every word down so that his testimony would be accurately preserved for future generations. And we are the beneficiaries of God's relentless insistence on recording everything he said in writing. We have none of this in the Jesus myth. Iosu Christu, now called Jesus Christ, unlike, I should say, the great liberator Moses, the articulate judge Samuel, the brilliant lyricist Dowd, known as David, or any of the prophets such as Yeshaya, Isaiah, Yirmiah, Jeremiah, and Zechariah. They did not scribe a single word, completely unlike everyone else who spoke for God. He didn't even ask his supposed disciples to commit anything he said to writing. I mean, we're dealing with the exact opposite. You have fastidious dedication to a contemporary written account as the words of God are being spoken, to not writing anything down, not mythical Jesus. I don't know, myths have hands anyway, but not mythical Jesus, not mythical Jesus's apostles that were never told to do so. And the first letter that we find, the first written account, appears 20 years later, and it's written by a complete and utter fraud. No, this isn't the least bit credible. There is only the remotest and most tortured of possibilities that one of the accounts, John, may have done so on his own initiative. But even then, it would have been 6 decades later that he would have written it when he was 90 years old. And even then, we have absolutely no indication of any kind that it was written by a quote-unquote disciple. Yeah, he would have been hobbling around Ephesus. Can you imagine? At a time when the average person who was not a Roman citizen lived to the ripe old age of about 25 in the Roman Empire. He would have been 90.
Highly unlikely.
Yeah. I think the possibility of that, and let's just say that that is the case, that it's this old guy and he's trying to remember what happened 60 plus years ago without having written anything down in the meantime in a different language than was spoken and that he learned as a child in a foreign language 60 years later, as he's now moved to one of the glory cities of Rome and Ephesus. And after all of that time, he said, yeah, I think maybe I should write some of this stuff down. What do you think? It was so important to me that every word was so important to me. I'm going to wait 60 years before I write any of this down.
Yeah, that makes you credible. not.
The whole thing is just ludicrous. He was as far removed in time and place for it to be even remotely credible. And the evidence in favor of his exceedingly unlikely happenstance is a triple hearsay clothed in incredulous religious fables. We can bemoan this reality, but we cannot deny it. So perhaps we should seek to understand it. And in this regard, the answer is staring us in the face. Yahweh inspired his prophets to speak to us and his son, our Messiah, Dowd, to act on our behalf. Yahweh's words lead to the Zeroah's lives and to his lyrics. Dowd was not here to provide additional prophecy or commentary, but instead to fulfill what he and other prophets had already written about him. We will find everything we need to know about the role and result of the Passover lamb scribed in the Towrah, NineB, wa Mizmor, notably in Kara, called out Leviticus, and in Yeshayah, Yahweh liberates and saves Isaiah, along with the Lamb's eyewitness accounts in the 22nd and 88th Mizmor Psalms. Well, that is a lot to digest. I would like to move on to other, albeit related matters. Dowd spoke for himself and for Yahweh, but against religion. He did not predict the arrival of another or sponsor a new faith. And since Dowd and Yahweh's words are available to us in the languages they themselves spoke and have been preserved, we already know what Dowd would have said if asked about these things. Hell no. Further, Sha'uwl Paul, to have claimed to have spoken for his fabled Iosu Christu, he would have had to have cited what he is alleged to have said in the Gospels. If he was appointed to speak for and to represent this character, Iosu Christu, who now only exists in the Gospels that were written 20 years after this letter, why didn't Paul once cite anything he said? Never once. And that makes the whole myth of Paul representing an Iosu Christu laughable.
Well, he says he speaks for God, but he doesn't actually quote anything.
Oh, when Paul claims to cite a prophecy to justify his ludicrous position, he never once quotes God accurately. Never once. He always takes the citation out of context, truncates it, and then misrepresents it so it conveys the opposite of what God actually said. And he does it 100 times. No, 0% possibility that any of this is true. And just reason alone dictates the answer. There isn't a single citation from Iosu Christus to be found anywhere within Paul's 14 letters. The closest he comes to is a misquote of his role as the Passover lamb in association with the covenant, which by itself invalidates the impostor's dependence upon replacement theology, because any association between Passover and the covenant completely obliterates Paul's entire proposition. Oops. To claim to speak for someone, to assert to have been chosen to represent them, and then never to have quoted anything that individual had to say. Yes, well, it's either disrespectful and disingenuous or just plain old deceitful. Simply stated, the self-proclaimed and wholly unsubstantiated assertion that Sha'uwl Paul was chosen to speak for anyone other than for himself, particularly Yahweh and his Messiah, Dowd, is a lie. And it is obvious and simple as that. To deny this reality is to be either ignorant or irrational or both. But then again, I suppose that's why they call it faith. Now, I wonder if Christians have ever considered why Paul's new name appeared first in his letter, and Yahweh's name was not mentioned. As a rabbi student, Paul would have known it and would have been taught to avoid it. But without it, there is a 0% possibility that he spoke for Yahweh. Moreover, Sha'uwl would have known that everyone, without exception, inspired by Yahweh, continually integrates Yahweh's name throughout their testimony and never mentions the name of or any other name for God. Not one. But Sha'uwl, Paul, did not mention Yahweh's name ever in any of his 14 letters, which means that his fraud was deliberate. By failing to incorporate Yahweh's name, like the rabbis after him, Paul conclusively demonstrated for all who are familiar with the Torah's test for inspiration that he was not a prophet and that he did not speak for God. The consequence, by the way, for this is death. And while we have been over this before, it bears repeating. God said, with absolute certainty, the person who proclaims a message on behalf of a deity, who deliberately oversteps their bounds and speaks arrogantly and presumptuously, defiantly and deliberately concocting a religious scheme for the express purpose of conveying words under my reputation and designation, which I have not expressly appointed, taught, authorized, or directed him to convey, or who speaks in the name of other or additional gods, then that prophet is clearly deadly. Devarim 18:20. And if you say, using your best judgment, how can we actually recognize and consistently know the statements which Yahweh himself has not spoken? Devarim 18:21. When a prophet speaks in the reputation and designation of Yahweh, and the matter discussed has not occurred or does not come to be, this is a message that Yahweh has not spoken to him. Such a prophet has stated it arrogantly, presumptively, and independently of his own accord. You should not revere or respect him for having conspired to incite an alienating rebellion. Devarim words, Deuteronomy 18:22. It is as if this was written explicitly to warn the world, especially Yisrael, about Sha'uwl Paul. Unlike Paul, neither Akiba nor Maimonides ventured into historical narratives or prophecy. And while Muhammad did both, he spoke of Allah, not the God of the Torah. Moreover, he was so pathetic, we don't need any help rejecting him. Of course, Yahweh's test for inspiration, one Paul failed as miserably as would Muhammad after him, does not stand alone. Before it, we find Yahweh repudiating religion. He said, indeed, when you come upon the land, which for the benefit of the relationship Yahweh your God is giving to you, you should not accept, learn, teach, or imitate, such that you act upon and engage in any semblance of any of the disgusting religious rites and political practices of the Gentiles. Same chapter, Devarim, words, Deuteronomy 18:9. There shall not be found among you one who causes his son or daughter to pass through or perish in flames, someone predicting the future based upon pagan religious notions, such as a false prophet or a conspiratorialist, a person who obscures the truth and believes in spiritualism, or one who tempts and charms others, an individual who entices and seduces people to worship and to pray, one who joins in and binds together by forming political or religious alliances, one who is obsessed with ghosts and makes requests of saints, or speaks on behalf of dead souls, a con man who beguiles in association with demonic spirits, or one who causes the premature death of others in association with a destructive plague. Devarim 18:11. For indeed, all who engage in and act upon these things are an abomination, considered abhorrent and detestable to Yahweh. And so, as a consequence of this repulsive religious excrement and filthy, idolatrous crap, Yahweh, your God, will drive them out. He will dispossess them and then destroy them from your presence. The Devarim words, Deuteronomy 18:12. Now, this warning is directed at the most pervasive and destructive Gentile religion in all of human history, particularly as you consider its effect on Jews, Appalling Christianity. Avoid it like the plague it has become. It was then that Yahweh revealed that we can be made right with him. And the means to this ideal state of affairs is through Dowd. And that is why God shared this amazing prophecy regarding his son and our Messiah and Savior. It reads, you can actually become completely and continually perfected by being consistently right, becoming acceptable with Yahweh, your God. Devarim, Deuteronomy 18:13. By comparison, these people from different races and places who you shall dispossess, who will dispossess and remove, they listen to false prophets who obscure the truth with myths. Anan, spellbinders, spiritualists, those blowing smoke. And they believe in antiquated religious notions and invalid opinion makers. But as for you, this is not the correct way. Yahweh, your God, has offered for you to approach. And then he said, speaking of Dowd, David, a prophet from among your midst, from your brethren, similar to me, Yahweh, your God, will raise up and position to take a stand, which establishes and affirms you. To him, I want you to actually and continually listen. This is consistent with everything which you requested while questioning Yahweh, your God, in Towrah during the day of the assembly when you said, never again let me hear the voice of Yahweh, my God, nor let me see and witness this intense fire anymore, lest I die. Therefore, Yahweh said to me, this is actually better. And they have appropriately conveyed their presence and preference. Which means that God in the flesh is not going to happen. Not going to see his fire, not going to hear directly from him. Okay. I will raise up and establish a prophet for them from among their brothers, similar to you. And I will put my words in his mouth, and I will convey, and he will convey them to you. Everything which for the benefit of the relationship I instructed him. Dowd was that prophet. And it shall come to be that an individual who will not listen to my words, which he shall declare in my name, I myself will seek it of him, and I will hold him accountable for it, requiring it of him. In other words, Dowd fulfilled Pesach, Matzah, and Bakudim, and spoke of it. And if you don't know it, God's going to hold you accountable for having missed it. So I want to express my appreciation to Yahweh for making this so easy for us. But I must apologize for how poorly we have responded. You asked us not to be religious and to be right with you instead. But then your people complained that they were uncomfortable in your presence. You presented the ideal solution, your beloved son, Dowd. And I'm sorry to say that it has taken us so very long to fully appreciate everything you have done for us through him. So it is long past time that we eradicate the viral plagues wrought by the likes of Paul, Akiba, and Muhammad, so that free of them, your people might return to you. Of course, it gets worse for the author of the Christian New Testament, because by excluding Yahweh's name from his letters and speeches, Sha'uwl Paul committed the lone unforgivable crime against God and man. Recorded in the third statement of the first tablet, the negation of Yahweh's name is listed as unforgivable, a crime for which there is no redemption. Having renounced it, and having done so publicly and egregiously, we can be assured that Sha'uwl will endure an eternity in Sheol, along with Satan the adversary, who possessed him and who inspired him. Now, while this is small barley, if you will, compared to the mountain of garbage that we have just considered, had Palos been correct about Dowd being Haimasiach in his letter, the pseudonym and title were reversed. And this is no Palos small mistake. With Iosu Christu, the errant name and erroneous title are reversed, giving the false impression that the individual's name was Jesus Christ. More on this in a moment. Now, turning to the final mistake on Paul's initial sentence, God did not die. God cannot die. He did not fall asleep either. With absolute certainty, we know that Dowd's Bashar corporal body was destroyed after having served its purpose, consistent with the Torah's instructions. Therefore, his corpse was not resurrected. All of this is a lie, wholly inconsistent with Yahweh's teaching and prophecy on the subject of the Passover lamb. By being Sadak right with Yahweh, Dowd represented the perfect Pesach El. Moments before his physical body was sacrificed on our behalf as the Pesach lamb, Dowd's nefesh soul spoke of the separation, or the separation certainly that he might have felt from Yahweh, and saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Well, what he was headed with his nefesh was into Sheol to carry our guilt and deposit it there. And after which time Dowd's soul was protected in Sheol by this set-apart spirit and reunited with Yahweh's spirit. Well, the Son of God re-entered the Father's home. Now, the reason he made this declarative statement was twofold. First, he wanted to direct our attention to the lyrics he wrote in his 22nd Mizmor, which begins with that statement, that God would help us understand that Dowd David is the one who was doing all of this on our behalf. It's there for all to see. It's the only eyewitness account of the fulfillment of Passover unyeasted bread and firstborn children. And it's excruciatingly graphic and precise. Now, the second reason that Dowd made this declaration is because it completely undermines the religion that would be used to mischaracterize him and misconstrue his sacrifice, to rob him of his achievements and accolades. Based upon this declaration, God did not die for anyone's sins. In fact, God did not die at all. It was Dowd's body who died, not even Dowd's nefesh soul. Further, Jesus Christ never existed, which would preclude the notion that he was God. With Dowd parting statement, there is nothing left of Christianity. Dowd says, Jesus is as much God as is Dionysus, upon which Jesus was also modeled. In his own words, as they were pronounced 1,000 years in advance by the Messiah and Son of God, Dowd's corporeal and beaten body was left on a Roman torture stake to die as the Passover lamb. Please pause once again and to consider the implications of this. He sacrificed his body to nurture the family and promote eternal life. And had the Pesach El not been offered on this occasion in concert with the Torah's instructions, we would have been deprived of the opportunity to live past this mortal existence. Yahowah had made this promise to Abraham, and he was affirming the covenant, saying that he would provide the El lamb, and he did with his beloved son, Dowd. This, of course, negates the foundation of replacement theology. According to Paul, Jews were condemned by his God because, well, they killed Jesus. And while it was Rome, not Jews, who slew the lamb, had Jews been responsible for leading the Passover lamb to the sacrifice, the world should be applauding them for doing what needed to be done. Therefore, we can be assured that the Christian mythology, underlying replacement theology, is invalid. God could not be angry with his people for doing what he intended. Just because men are capricious and unreliable does not mean that God turned away from Israel, withdrawing every promise he had made on their behalf. He did not transfer these sworn oaths to the people who murdered the Lamb of God either. The Romans who became Roman Catholics and the Roman Catholic Church, well, no, they would be part of the plot. They're on the wrong side. So the case for Christendom has quickly unraveled. In accordance with the Torah, the physical body of the Passover lamb was offered so that we might live. His soul, however, did not die. It descended into Sheol, the place of separation from God, on the mikra of matzah, known as unyeasted bread, to remove the fungus of religion and political rebellion from our souls. It was the most horrid experience imaginable, and thus hardly a snooze. The consequence of ignoring Pesach and matzah, which is precisely what Paul did in his opening declaration, is life and death, salvation versus damnation. Without Passover, we remain mortal. Without matzah, we retain our guilt. So while Bikurim, firstborn children, once warrants our attention, without Pesach and matzah, there is nothing to celebrate. Now, should you credit Paul with an indirect mention of the Passover lamb and that he acknowledged that there was a corpse, there is something far worse than failing to capitalize on Pesach. It is why Pesach and matzah are one contiguous event, one inseparable from the other. To benefit from Passover while ignoring unyeasted bread is to become eternally separated from God. He calls this outcome She'uwl, hell. That was Paul's invitation to Christians. It is synonymous, of course, with Sha'uwl, since he has naming rights, because he has directed more souls there than any other. There are depictions, big and small, woven into this deceiver's claim that should be noted as deceptions. God Father, the one having roused and wakened him out of a lifeless corpse, necros, death, uselessness, futile, a vain carcass, an ineffectual, powerless, and deceased cadaver, a dead body having breathed its last. Now, God did not rouse his beloved Son. The body of the Passover lamb never comes back to life. The Passover El restores our lives, not his own. There would have been no purpose to the sacrifice if Dowd's body had been reanimated, rising from the dead. Assuring that the observant individual would never make this mistake, Yahowah told us to incinerate the inedible portions of the Pesach El after being nourished by the meal. Therefore, the same evening the Mashiach, Dowd's body, served as the lamb, his corpse was destroyed. It was incinerated by Yahweh's light. This is from Shemoth Names, Exodus 12:10. There could not have been a bodily resurrection of someone fulfilling Passover because there was no longer a body. For those who may protest saying that the alleged disciples saw him, let's keep it real. Even in the myths attributed to the misnomer Jesus, his mother and the women in his life mistook him for a gardener. The fellows on the road to Emmaus, who had been in Jerusalem as these events were transpiring, were clueless as to who he was when he approached them on that day, according to Luke 24:13-18. The same evening, with his supposed followers, he not only passed through a wall, something a physical body cannot accomplish, even they did not recognize him. John 20:19. When his soul reunited with his father's Ruach, Dowd was no longer using the tortured body that had served this purpose. If he had made any appearance in our physical world, which is highly unlikely, it would have been as the covenant children will one day be and be able to do by transferring a small amount of his spiritual energy into matter as a result of Passover unyeasted bread and firstborn children, and having been enriched and empowered by his father. But it would have been no purpose for it. He had already provided the eyewitness. That is a whole lot better than returning in the body. The Romans had mutilated, actually, and distorted when they tortured him. It is why I'm so disgusted, as is God, by the Christian propensity to worship Jesus Christ as the dead God on a stick, and then claim that his ravaged body was resurrected. It's disgusting. Physical bodies are burdensome, folks. They're limiting. They degrade over time. With a body, we cannot leave this solar system, much less explore the universe or enter heaven. Bodily resurrection is physically impossible and totally counterproductive. The miracle is a result of Chag Matzah, where the perfected becomes Yahweh's child, a member of the covenant family, enriched, empowered, and enlightened by him. But the beneficiaries are souls, not bodies. During those 3 days, Dowd's regenerated body that Yahowah put him in when he returned him 1,000 years after the end of his first life served as the Passover lamb. And what was left of it after enduring Roman torture was incinerated, ceasing to exist in harmony with the Torah's instructions. His soul then entered She'uwl on Matzah to unleaven our souls. Then on the Mikra of Bakurim, known as firstborn children, the Makor, the firstborn of gods, the Messiah, according to God's soul, was reunited with his father, becoming the firstborn of the covenant. Thereby the Torah's promise to make us immortal, to perfect us, to adopt us was fulfilled. That's God's story. It holds together, not this mush by Paul. Then, as further evidence that a corpse was not reanimated or resurrected, as Paul has written, the only common denominator among the 3 gospel accounts after the fulfillment of Passover and a snooze on matzah because, well, they didn't have any idea what happened, was that no one recognized him. Not very credible, is it? In the opening statement, Paul got everything wrong. His name, his title, his status, his sponsor, his inspiration, Dowd's name and title, Yahweh's name, the relationship between Yahweh and his beloved Son, all while promoting the myth that God died, fell asleep on the job, and was bodily resurrected from a corpse. It was not an auspicious beginning. God himself proves that each of the explanations I have laid before you is valid. In due time, we will consider Yahweh's position on each of them, because without continually sharing Yahweh's view, this book fails to live up to its potential. My goal is not to leave Christians floundering, but instead to replace the lies that Paul has sown with the truth according to God. I will take away nothing that is worthwhile, but for those who are receptive, I will provide you with a clear and correct path to God. In this regard, Sha'uwl Paul did not say, at least in his opening line, that he was speaking for God the Father. That subtly is lost on most Christians who have replaced Yahweh with their Lord Jesus Christ, in effect focusing on a myth as opposed to God. This issue isn't insignificant. Even if we were to play along and pretend that there was a Jesus Christ, he could not have been equivalent to God. Even by the myth's own admission, he is cited saying, "The Father is greater than am I." John 14:28. All of God cannot fit into human form, and the undiminished presence of God would consume our planet, our solar system, our galaxy, the universe. This known, the possibility of a diminished manifestation of God in this way is only possible in some very complicated processes. I mean, you can take Einstein's famous equation, E = mc squared, and you can understand how a soul, which is energy and enveloped in light, can take some tiny aspect of it and become matter, because the energy is the matter times the square of the speed of light. So since Yahweh is spirit and describes himself as light, he is energy. Men are corporeal and thus matter. Einstein's formula reveals that energy and matter are exactly the same thing. They're just not the equivalent amount of the same thing. You know, it's like a tiny little speck of a diamond and a house built of diamonds would be a comparison. He proved that matter was a substantially diminished form of energy. If the mythical Jesus was the equivalent of Yahweh, what known as the Lord's Prayer, Matthew 6:9, becomes nonsensical. It would have had Jesus saying, "Pray to me who is not in heaven, set apart is my name, my kingdom come, my will be done in earth as it is in heaven." Recognizing that they were not the same thing, it's curious that Paul saw himself representing the mythical representation. Now, a Greek word that we translate apostle from apostolo, when used correctly, is important. It means to be set apart, prepared, and equipped. While Palos was the furthest thing from this, even today, far too many individuals go off pretending to be witnesses without first studying the Torah and prophets. As a result, those who are inadequately prepared and improperly enlightened, well, as we have witnessed, they do far more harm than good, because they typically say and write stuff that's really stupid. Paul was also missing from what would have been the most important event recorded in Acts had it been true, the fulfillment of the fourth invitation to be called out and meet of 7 Shabbats, what Christians have errantly called Pentecost 50. Those fooled into believing that during the Mikra, the supposed disciples were filled with the Holy Spirit, Acts 2, have a number of issues to overcome. First, Shabu is a harvest, and there was none on this day. Second, those harvested must previously have benefited from the fulfillment of the first three Mikra, because it is a Bekurim harvest, and Bekurim is the result of Pesach and Matzah. You could not have benefited from Shabuah without observing all three, none of which they have paid any attention to. All of which, of course, the New Testament denies. And third, the wheat harvest of Shabuah is in our future. It was not in our past 2,000 years ago. It will occur in succession, May 22nd, 2026, and June 11, 2027. This is 7 years prior to Dowd's return with Yahowah. Even in the gospel fables, there were 12 disciples chosen by Jesus. Not one was religious, as was the case with Paul, who called himself a really good rabbi. They were said to have accompanied him and witnessed his every word and deed. And that is why they were referred to as disciples, meaning those who learn. But from this introduction, as well as from the introduction Palos wrote to the Corinthians, Romans, Colossians, and Ephesians, we know that Sha'uwl Paul was too full of himself to be a learner. So he passed on the disciple moniker altogether. It was beneath his ego. He would instead be the teacher. Still, Paul coveted a title that did not belong to him by his craving to be seen as important and credible. By arrogantly and presumptuously overstepping his bounds, he knew that every word of what he had written, it was a lie. And he would repeat these lies many times. Now, one of the reasons we know that Palos intended to convey apostle as a title rather than use apostolos as a descriptive term is that his letters to Rome and Corinth, he writes, Palos called an apostle. The people and women he fooled called him by the title he craved. Since Paul claimed to speak for God, it is our responsibility to consider his statement in the light of the Devarim words, Deuteronomy 13 and 18 tests that were established by God to evaluate the legitimacy and consequence of such assertions. While we will dive into the first of these in the future as we move through other chapters of Paul's letters, suffice it to say for now, Yahowah revealed that the best way to recognize who is and isn't speaking for him is to realize what he himself has previously conveyed and whether or not he specifically acknowledged the role that that person would play in the past through prior prophecies. No Sha'uwl mention other than to say he was the plague of death. There is no denotation of an apostle title. None of this was foretold. Therefore, Paul lied. And he didn't speak for Yahowah. Now, to accomplish what needs to be known to validate or invalidate Paul, we must examine and carefully consider the Towrah and juxtaposition what Paul said next to it. Yahowah was clear, revealing that no one is authorized to add to or subtract from his Towrah. So if you negate it, you're a liar. If we witness the Torah's role in our lives being diminished by anyone like Paul, or we find a writer adding something new to it, like the rabbis and the Talmud, or like a new covenant, we should be careful because such a person is not speaking for God, even though they're claiming to do so. In Devarim 13, Yahowah reveals that if the prophet stands up and establishes himself as Palos has done, he is a false prophet. If he claims to have performed miracles as Palos will do, he is a false prophet. If he encourages his audience to go after other gods by other names, like the Romans Gratia or the Greek Charis, whom Paul sponsored, even the Iosu Christus, he is a false prophet. If he promotes religious worship, which is the result of Palos's letters, he is a false prophet. If his writings fail to affirm his love and respect for Yahowah, when he does not even know him, he is a false prophet. And that is a problem for Palos, because he implies that Yahowah is incompetent, impotent, and far, far worse. In addition, a man is a false prophet if he encourages anyone to disregard the terms and conditions of the bereth or the mikre of Yahowah, the covenant or the invitations to meet, which comprise Yahweh's way. And of such prophet, God says they are in opposition to him, both ruinous and deadly, so that we should completely remove their disagreeable, displeasing, and evil corruptions from our midst. Then in volume 18, as we are aware, Yahowah delineated the 6 signs of a false prophet. They claim to speak for him. They are arrogant, overstepping their bounds. Their words are inconsistent with the Torah's instructions. They recite the names of foreign gods. Their historical presentations are inaccurate, and their prophetic promises fail to materialize. Sha'uwl Paul failed every codicil of this test. Everyone. In his opening salvo, Paul claimed that he did not represent any man or any human institution, and that would, of course, include the ecclesia, which is the Greek term which has been co-opted to represent the Christian church. And what would have, that of course would have made Sha'uwl a freelancer, an operator on his own recognizance, an independent contractor, because he did not associate himself even with his own ecclesia, church. The flip side of this admission is also problematic. If Sha'uwl Paul did not write on behalf of what he learned from religious teachers in rabbinical school, then his ubiquitous references to the nomos must denote the Torah as opposed to the Talmud. This being the case, the principal methodology used by those who are Torah observant to reconcile Paul's epistles with Yahweh's word was torn asunder by this statement, because they all claim that Paul was speaking of the Talmud, not the Torah, when he is negating it. But if he is not taught by men, he can't be referencing the Talmud, could he? The facts are evident. They're undeniable. There is no getting around the realization that the nomos is an object of scorn and ridicule in this epistle. And at no time does Sha'uwl associate the nomos with rabbinic law, citing Talmudic sources. Not once, ever. On the contrary, his examples and citations are all from the Torah, clearly identifying the document he is assailing. And that's a death knell. Also convicting, if Palos was speaking for Iosus, why didn't he quote him? If he was Yahweh's messenger, why is Yahweh's word discounted and never cited accurately in any one of Paul's letters? Why, if Paul was speaking for God, is his most repeated theme and line, "But I, Palos, say"? If Sha'uwl was Yahweh's apostle, why do his letters contradict God? Probably a good place for us to conclude this program. We'll return to our Rainbow studio on another day. We thank you for listening to Appalling Twistianity.